my video pop up here. We will be good to go. Hey guys, it's Josh with College Football Nerds coming at you live on a Saturday. We've had a big day full of upsets. A lot of ranked matchups are sort of getting into the heart of college football this year. I'll say I'm sorry that Daniel's not going to be able to join us. He's either on vacation or I've locked him in a closet somewhere. I'll let you guys figure that one out. But I'm happy to talk about things. We're going to get into all the biggest games. Obviously, that Alabama game looming. You can see the color scheme I got rocking today in order of the Vols. And then we're going to talk about all the other matchups because I think there are a lot of interesting results. Even some games live. Don't know how many of those we'll get to be able to do given the timing of the show, but we're going to get into it. So I'll ask you guys in the comments. You want me to talk about something, put it in there. As a solo host, it's a little easier for me to interact with you guys, but only if you interact with me in the comments. So I'll try to keep my eye on it as much as I can, given the fact that it's very hard to talk, look at the camera, and read something off screen at the same time. So I think the first thing I'd say about this week is I think it proves some things we said really right. It proves some things we said really wrong. The past week, there were two takes that we had that really drew a lot of ire. The first one was takes in the fact that Quinn Ewers, at least in my opinion, and I'll be the one to own that part of it, he's a quarterback that is supremely talented, but when I went back and looked at film, I felt like he was a redshirt freshman. Ewers, I think in time is going to be probably a top 10 draft pick. I feel like that's sort of a safe prediction. But I also think there are times right now where he doesn't necessarily know what he needs to do with the football. And there are, the obvious ones, the backward pass he threw where he's just trying to throw it away in a screen. But there's some other ones too. It's a lot of routine plays he's missing where he's got guys open. He doesn't make the correct read or doesn't make the read fast enough. But what Texas is able to do right now with him is they can use him as just a tool. If he's got a guy open and he throws it, doesn't matter where he's at on the field, pretty high percentage chance that Quinn Ewers is going to complete it. And even single read throws where the guy is in coverage, but it's a small window, Ewers is fantastic. But there are times when, if a guy is actually bracketed or covered well, Ewers doesn't execute that well. So his effectiveness is always going to ebb and flow, really, first off with Bijan Robinson, because Texas won that game today against Iowa State purely off Bijan. And second, his effectiveness is going to come down to the fact that he's got a fantastic play caller in Sarkisian. And the more Sarkisian can do to get guys open, to make sure he has those one-on-ones, to keep him from having to make reads, the more effective Quinn Ewers will be. And I think with time, he's going to get better and better at the mental aspect of the game. I'm not saying he's bad, but if you watch him, and I know a couple other people have commented on this, I've seen various places, his head doesn't really turn from his primary receiver most of the time. And Iowa State was a good enough defense to, I think, show where some of the chips were. But the truth is, I don't know that there's really another good defense in the Big 12 outside of Texas, at least one that's good enough to really challenge him. So I don't know how much those words are going to show or going to matter, but that was a take we had that I think was fairly right. Now, let's talk about a take we had that was not so right. And that's where we were talking about how, when we said you have to throw out or too much is being made of that first quarter of the Texas game against Alabama, that, Alabama's defensive backs probably aren't as bad as they looked in that quarter. That take doesn't look so hot as of right now because they got shredded, man. I mean, just shredded by the Volunteers. A stat we threw up on Twitter was that's the first time in the last decade that Alabama's given up over 8 yards per play. It's the first time since Johnny Manziel did it to them. And I was looking at it. There were a couple times where somebody had over 10 yards per attempt against Alabama. That's really the first, I think, high volume time that's happened to them. So it was just utterly, utterly shredded. I do find it funny that it's funny how these things work, right? That the same Ohio State fans that said, "Oh, that's not an opinion we hold. Why you put that on us?" are also the first ones to come out right now and say Alabama's DBs suck and we knew it all along. But I think you do have to question it. And with that, I do want to get into a little bit of the Alabama game against Tennessee and sort of break down what I saw in it. And I'll start. There's a couple super chats, and guys, I'm going to try to keep up with super chats, but bear with me with the delay. Again, I've got to look at different screens to be able to see what's going on right now. Caleb Talk says to slow UT, you have to jam them at the line of scrimmage. Pitt showed that, but Bama never figured that out nor adjusted. Should Bama fans be looking at the DC? And Darius Williams said somebody left DeMarco Hellams in the oven too long. That boy burnt extra crispy. Both those comments really come to the same concept, I think. And that's the fact that Tennessee was able to scheme Alabama into a position where they were able to get the matchups they wanted. And this gets into a little bit the nuance that I think people don't always like to get into. Alabama does have some really good defensive back players. They do. The McKinstry, and I'm see if I can pull up the stat here in a second. It's hard to do while I'm talking. I think he was barely involved in this game. So they've got one boundary corner. I don't know how many times he was targeted. I'm guessing less than 5, maybe less than 3. He's the guy that got the interception on the tip and ran it back when that was called for a PI. And that guy's a first-round corner. But it doesn't matter because they weren't going to throw it at him. Jordan Battle at safety was targeted a couple times with a receiver on him, but he generally tackled the guy pretty well or contested the throw, never really got burned. The problem for Alabama was really in the first corner, the other corner, Arnold, got matched up some with Hyatt, lost that battle a good bit, at least enough to get burned on a couple big plays. He's also, there's, get into this later, there's a play like he slips and falls down and Tennessee overthrows it. But the biggest thing was when Tennessee went and split the field. So they got 2 by 2. And sometimes they have a tight end. Sometimes it was 4 wide receivers. But what they were usually able to do was to get 2 wide receivers in either side, and they would get them matched up with 2 DBs. And Alabama played most of that game out of nickel. So they've got a corner on each side, boundary corner, McKinstry, and they have Arnold. I'm sorry, my nose is extremely itchy right now. And then they have what is really a safety playing nickel in Brian Branch, and they've got Hellams, and they have Battle. And depending on how they arranged it, Alabama was constantly put in a tough spot. And why do I say that? Because Alabama struggled with Tennessee's run game. The stat that I've kind of talked about a little bit, I was the one tweeting on this part of it live during the game. Alabama had really significant issues in that game in trying to stop Tennessee's ability to run, particularly on first down. And when you can't stop the run on first down, it does a lot of things to the way your defense wants to play. What do I mean by that? So let me try to pull up the stats live here. If you go and look at the box score, right, and you look at where everything's at with these, with these players, Hooker had a near perfect 94.2 QBR, 21 of 30, so just over 2/3 passing. His completion percentage wasn't crazy. But the thing that really sticks out to me is you look at Wright was 12 carries for 71 yards. Hooker was 14 carries for 56 yards. Small was 12 carries for 53 yards. Those guys are all running 4 to 6 yards a carry. And the thing that really struck me is Alabama was trying to play that game, if they could, a little light in their front. Because if you've got 6 guys in the box, right? If you got 2 guys wide and Alabama has to have 6 defenders in the box, you get 4 and 2. That leaves you with 5 players elsewise. So you've got 2 receivers, 5 guys to cover. Do the math there. If you've got a safety, either the safety's over one group and not the other, or the safety's middle field and isn't really on top of either one. And remember, Alabama is running out of nickel. So those 5 defenders, 2, 2, and 1, one of them is a free safety. One of them is a strong safety. One is a nickel that's really a safety. So what you kept seeing is these 2 stacks where when they release, Hellams, number 2, who's a strong safety, ends up in coverage on a wide receiver. And on the other side, Branch, who's also a safety, would often end up in man coverage with a wide receiver. And Tennessee was very intentional to make sure that wide receiver, as often as possible, was Hyatt. And so when people talk about the number, how good Alabama's DBs are, I do think McKinstry is a first-round draft pick at corner. I think Battle is probably a first-round draft pick at safety. I think Arnold may end up being a first-round draft pick at corner. They've got Eli Ricks, who's sitting on the bench the entire game. They have an all-American corner sitting on the bench while they have 2 safeties in man coverage. And that really gets to the conclusion that I'm trying to get to here. People want to talk matchups and players being burned. This is a scheme issue. And it's the same sort of problem we talked about when Ohio State played Alabama in the 2020 national title. A lot of people wanted to rag on Chase Ward, or they wanted to talk about how those slow Ohio State linebackers got burned by Devonta Smith. You know what? It's not really on Ward, and it's not on your linebackers, okay? You shouldn't have a safety trying to follow a Heisman Trophy winning receiver and expecting him to cover him one-on-one. It's not going to work. So the problem here really was scheme. The problem is, yeah, Alabama has some players that can't cover a one-on-one because you know what? Alabama has safeties. And it doesn't matter how good your safeties are. Your safeties, your strong safety ain't going to cover Hyatt successfully one-on-one for 20 throws in a ball game, especially when you have a great quarterback like Hooker who was delivering dimes to his players. So in that regard, the coaching staff at Tennessee just whipped Alabama. They knew what they were going to do. They set out and they said, look, this is working and we're just going to do it over and over again. And we're going to do it until you stop us. And I think the sad thing is it wasn't particularly complicated. I mean, what they were doing and what I described is really just about all there is to it. And Alabama didn't really have an adjustment. And I think it says a little bit about how complicated maybe Alabama's defensive schemes are, that they can't just roll out a corner and say, look, you're going to cover number one and you're going to be on man, right? In an ideal world, they take one of those corners, either they take McKinstry and put him on him and say, he's your guy for the game, or you take Ricks off the bench and put him on him in the slot. But you put somebody on him in man coverage and you don't let off, and that's it. And you say, we're going to have a fast guy that's not going to get burned over the top. And you avoid like the late score that really kept Tennessee in it, where it was like 90 yards. That was Malachi Moore, who's the dime safety trying to cover him in man coverage. And then the other safety crashes into him. They don't have a real corner in coverage. So that's the situation they should have avoided. But let's talk about the other side of this, I think, which, everybody's going to focus on the DBs, right? And it's really the same story, 2018 Clemson versus Alabama when they blew them out. I think from the defensive side of the ball, these games are similar. But in that regard, the thing that makes it similar, I think, is the fact that Alabama was constantly in man coverage, defending deep shots, and they're doing it because there's no pass rush. Alabama in that game, they've got a guy that was, we've sort of hyped up as being the number one pick in the NFL draft, and Will Anderson, and he was a ghost. And they've got another guy in Dallas Turner that we think is a first-round draft pick pass rusher, and he was a ghost. And there was no pressure. And if you've got six guys in the box, which means we've got that situation, right, where you've got two, one safety over the top, you can't really cover deep. Those six guys need to be getting home. And they couldn't do that. And so you end up in the spiraling situation, right? And sometimes to try to get help on the outside, Alabama tried to go lighter in the box. They would go 3 down and then 2 linebackers over the top. Right? I never really saw 4-by-1, which was interesting. 4 down and 1 linebacker. That's the obvious thing to do to try to get another safety on the field. But the problem was Tennessee kept running the ball for 6 yards on first down. And that means you can't lighten up that much in the box. And what you would see with this game with Tennessee, you'd feel like they threw, and then come back and run. That was them playing depending on the numbers Alabama had, and they were either throwing it or running it depending on the fronts. That's the difference in Tennessee. Last year when they played Georgia and Alabama, they had about 55, 65 yards rushing in those 2 games. This year, total rushing stats for Tennessee, 182 yards rushing. That's the number. The number 2, this was the number 2 defense in the country in yards per play, but it was the number 1 defense in the country in yard per carry, as I recall, 1 or 2. And they just shredded them on the ground. And that made everything else open up, because if Alabama could have played with a light front, that is 3 down, 2 linebackers, they could have kept 2 safeties deep. They could have played tighter man coverage. The safety could have been deeper than the deepest. You probably don't give up those deep throws. It was the run game and the continual success of the run game that forced Alabama in formations where they couldn't keep safeties back. And that's what really burned them. And I think even late in the game, they really sort of tried to play more dime. That's when, again, Moore got burned. But this comes back to the fact that even when they switched to dime, they did it by putting another safety in, really, not really another true corner, and that wasn't effective. That's a schematic failure by Alabama, but it is also a personnel failure. The inability to stop the run, the inability to rush the passer is absolutely an indictment on their defense. It's an indictment on what they got out of their pass rush, and this what we thought would be the strength. The reason I thought Alabama would win that game is I thought Alabama would be able to contain the run with light numbers. Again, that if you want to talk 2018 Clemson, that's what they did to Alabama. They played a light box most of that game. They were able to contain the run. They still got maybe 4 yards of carry, but they were able to contain the run with a light box, which meant if they can give up 4 yards of carry with an extra defender in the secondary, then you take away the deep shots and you get interceptions and stuff like that. And I think the crazy thing here is you can say that Hendon Hooker played out of his mind. I'll be blunt. I think Bryce Young was the better quarterback in this game. Hendon Hooker was very accurate. He was consistent. He made some good throws within 10 or 15 yards. He actually had a handful of overthrows deep that, like one of them I said, DB falls down, overthrows him, misses a touchdown. They had like drop passes. They had an overthrow that was an interception in the game. They could have beaten them worse on the offensive side of the ball. And that's crazy. Now, I will say defensively, offensively for Alabama, they looked better than they had really at any point this year. They moved the ball effectively outside the first few drives where, that second drive of the game, shooting themselves in the foot, moving backwards, and ended up punting the ball, may well have lost them the game, which is kind of crazy to say. But if that's your standard, I think you're nitpicking a little too much. The only thing I'll say there is Tennessee is 126 in the country coming in pass defense. And then they lose another corner in the game. This was not expected to be a defense that was ever going to slow down Alabama. It was always expected Alabama would score 30, 40, maybe even 50 points in the game. So the fact that they had a shootout where they lost in a shootout, I think it says something for Alabama that they were efficient enough to move the ball. But I also think it's a major negative. And this gets back to maybe my final point before I try to move on to something else here. Explosiveness is a big thing. And Alabama was pretty efficient, and they move the ball in 10 to 15-yard chunks, but they're just not explosive right now. Part of it is the wide receiving core not getting over the top. Part of it is the fact that the offensive line, whereas Tennessee is facing a 4-man front or a 5-man blitz, and they're stoning them, Alabama couldn't really keep there from being pressure with 3 or 4 men a lot of times. And that means they don't have time to have the late developing routes. They don't have time to throw deep over coverage. And the explosiveness gone. And if you've got to have, I mentioned at one point, Alabama had a 19-play drive, counting penalties, 19 plays they played in that game. If you've got to do that, the odds of you having 19 plays and not doing something stupid are slim. Whereas Tennessee, if you can score in 5 on a big play, it makes it a lot easier, right? A false start or an offsides or something, false start, holding call, whatever. They don't come up because you don't play as many snaps. You don't need as many snaps. So they do come up, then you can replace it with an explosive. Or, if it's 1st and 10 and you have a false start and it's 1st and 15, the explosive negates that on 2nd down. So that's, I think, the other side of it is that Tennessee statistically was a lot more explosive than Alabama, and that kind of blew it open. But, at the end of the day, it'll be interesting to see if Alabama makes adjustments from this. It'll be interesting to see if Alabama has any changes to their approach defensively. I think they were caught really flat-footed schematically with what Tennessee was trying to do, which is kind of shocking. Probably an assumption that we mostly worked last year, so it'll work this year. I'll be curious to see how Georgia handles them, because Georgia, this game was a lot like Georgia's SEC championship game with Alabama, where they tried to do what we do, and it wasn't well built for what the other offense is trying to do when they get torched. Does Georgia learn from this game? Are they more aggressive in some ways? And, I think you've got to play more corners against Tennessee when they're so spread out. And part of the reason Alabama plays safeties is if you have a safety in the nickel, that really helps you on edge run support. But when you make that safety guard way out wide on a stack, he's effectively playing corner. So now you've got a safety playing out of position. I think you've got to consider using different personnel if you got them. Or Georgia's personnel in the secondary may be good enough without. That's certainly an interesting game. And, hey, let's be honest, Alabama still has very much the inside track on winning the SEC West. So there's a good chance the winner of the Georgia-Tennessee game is going to play Alabama. So we'll see at the end of the day how that one turns out anyway, right? So this is, again, a little bit academic in terms of what's going to happen in the future. But that's my spiel. Huge win for the Tennessee Volunteers, breaking a 15-game losing streak to Alabama. I also think a 38 or 39-game losing streak to top 10 teams. And I think they're legit. I don't think the defense is great. That makes me think they're going to drop another game because it's just hard to win when your defense is that bad. But their offense is absolutely one of the best in the country, truly. I think may even, frankly, be the best in the country behind Ohio State. And, yeah, Ohio State fans are sitting there licking their chops because it sure looks like with their quarterback and their talent. And I'll say right now, people talk about number 1 pick in the draft. There's no doubt in my mind people are taking C.J. Stroud before they're taking Hendon Hooker. Those receivers at Ohio State are better than the receivers at Tennessee. I think right now that you can kind of feel a little confident rubbing your hands if you're an Ohio State fan looking at that Alabama secondary. But, it's a long rest of the year, and we'll see how – and it's a very, again, particular scheme that I'm not sure Ohio State runs in the same way. So we'll see how or if Alabama adjusts. All right, let me try to turn back to Super Chats. So Darius Williams said – I'm going to finish the Alabama ones before we move on the topic. When Alabama needed Will Anderson the most, he vanished. Yeah, and I mentioned that earlier. Alabama's pass rush, I thought, would be the factor that would make a difference in this game, and it wasn't. And if Alabama had a pass rush in this game, and in the couple times, right, the interception that Hooker threw, They had an interior pass rush, a guy in his face. He didn't step into the throw. He did not look the same. He didn't throw that well, actually, when he was pressured. But that Tennessee offensive line dominated the entire night. Killtack9 said, always a big supporter of the channel, which I appreciate. Well, Bama found a way to give it away. The hurry up was just deadly. Bama still has a shot, but not with the penalties and dumb decisions. Who picks up a football after seeing two teammates run past it, fall on it? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. And as we say a lot, there's things like turnovers, fumbles, stupid mistakes that are random luck until they're not. And for right now, I would say with Alabama, they're not. Alabama had an inordinate amount of penalties in the Texas game and the Texas A&M game, and now the Tennessee game. This is who Alabama is. They are not a disciplined football team per the norm for Saban. This group of DBs is grabby. They do commit pass interference. Now, I think the refs were ticky-tacky. I think they were ticky-tacky on both sides. The pass interference call that gave Alabama a score early on was a lot of complaints, but it's sort of the same world. The DB runs through a guy, and if they saw contact or they saw guys really jostling for position, they tended to call PI in that game. Those are things that are at this point sort of endemic to Alabama, and so they're going to have to play a lot cleaner football to turn that around. All right, so with that one, let's move on now, trying to keep things going and talk about Michigan versus Penn State. So Benjamin V said, thank you so much for Daniel's shout out in the Michigan Penn State preview. Made my day. Did your opinion on Michigan change at all today? Any chance versus OSU if the game were today? It's interesting because I think, my opinion of Michigan changed a little bit in how explosive they were with the run. Now, you're just talking to me, and I've always held that I thought Corum is one of the most explosive rushers in the country. He and Gibbs are particularly good in that regard. I think maybe Bijan Robinson is a better running back overall, if I'm being honest. But Bijan is a guy that will get you 6 yards out of 2 on a consistent basis. And he has some big runs. But the burst that Corum has, maybe to a greater degree even than Gibbs has, allows them to have explosives in the run game. And that's a huge luxury. And what I saw today out of Michigan, they threw the ball reasonably well, but it was very much set up by the run. I mean, Penn State gave up, 400 yards rushing? I'm trying to pull up the box score as I talk right now. Normally we do this off camera when we ask questions to the other person. So I hope you guys appreciate how I'm managing to juggle all this at once. 418 yards rushing. Edwards at 173 yards and 16 carries. Guys, that's 10 yards a carry. So that would be a good average if you were throwing the ball in terms of attempts, and to have it on a per carry average is nuts. And then rushing, I will say they gave up some yardage rushing. The big trick in that game is that Penn State just could not sustain any offense. They had a total of 51 plays in the game to 79 for Michigan, and that was more than anything the story, right? And I think people look at total yardage and see that domination, and it's accurate, but I don't think it tells the full picture. The bigger deal there is Penn State goes 4 of 12 on third down. They go 1 of 4 on fourth down. Michigan is 11 of 17 on third downs, right? Michigan faced more third downs than Penn State did, but they converted at a much higher clip, which means they stay on the field. They're able to continue, and slowly they grind it out. The past couple years with Ohio State, I think there's something to be said for the fact that they've had trouble with teams that can really run the ball at a high level on a consistent basis. They've gotten pushback. They've played much better in that regard this year, and I'm not ready to make a call on it. But if you're a Michigan fan and you want to look at the blueprint for how you beat Ohio State last year, I think in many ways Michigan is better at doing the things they did last year offensively that gave Ohio State issues. The question is on the defensive side of the ball, and frankly, I think that one's tough. We were expecting both these teams to score like 17 to 20 points, right? So 17 points for Penn State, knowing one of them is a non-offensive touchdown. I get that. It didn't shock me. And they had nowhere to throw the ball. But again, this was my critique of Penn State. I do not believe that Penn State has high-level skill position talent right now. And when I say high level, I mean top 5, top 10 competition-worthy skill position talent. And that really cripples you. And in this sort of game, it really means that Penn State, with, I think, a quarterback that knows what to do pre-snap in Clifford, but isn't the greatest arm, just ends up being exceptionally limited. So yeah, that's sort of my take on Michigan from that. And I'll say Stephen Light here. Michigan beat the crap out of us. Obviously, Stephen is a big Penn State fan and big supporter of the channel, as we always appreciate. So our season returns to mediocrity. Here's a contribution to your, as always, excellent coverage. I'm going back to my bottle of Ouzo, which I will now finish up. I respect it. This is the reason I have such a love-hate relationship, I think, with Penn State fans. Again, my wife is one of those, as are most of my in-laws. Penn State is a good football team. And what happens every year is Penn State is a good football team. Their schedule tends to be kind of backloaded. They get to this point, 5-0, 6-0, and they want to say we're an elite football team. They want to say we're a top 10 football team. It's a difference here, guys. And you get into this kind of game, and there are stuff like the Penn State run defense that look good, just like Alabama's pass defense today, that suddenly looks like a sieve because you get exposed in different ways than you had before. And that's what happened to Penn State. I think they're a good football team. Great. My watch doesn't even understand what I'm saying, but they're a good football team. They're going to win a lot of games this year. They were never really a serious playoff contender in my mind. Floating around the top 10, I still think is a meaningful and worthwhile way to rank them. Michigan is a legitimate top 3, top 4 team this year. There's not a shame in losing to them. There's really not even a shame to losing to them badly. A lot of teams will. A lot of teams would. But yeah, it's just sort of, do you see it as hating to say that Penn State is not a top 10 team? That's the question. A lot of people have a hard time with it, but that's where I think they are. So next super chat, Paul Dodd. Sean Clifford or watching Thursday Night Football without alcohol? And someone said Sean Clifford or taking your kids to see Frozen was another spinoff of that. I still think it's Sean Clifford because that Thursday Night Football game should not be watched by people without some sort of adult supervision. I live in Washington. I'm not a Commanders fan. There's a reason for that. I went to the last game. I think it was the last game RG3 maybe started, and they got up to a lead on the Dolphins and then basically false started their way into losing it because they had absolutely no discipline. And it was that with both teams being equally bad in that regard. Only one team was actually managed to be worse than the Commanders. People love the NFL, man. But there are things worse than Sean Clifford in this world. Mike Farino said, how's it going? What's everybody drinking? I'm drinking water because I'm talking. Or at least you can assume it's water, not vodka. And then I don't know. I'll be curious if everybody else can throw in here what they're doing, what they're drinking, what they're watching. I was watching the tail end of this LSU Florida game because it looked like it'd get interesting, and now looks like it won't. So I'm kind of curious to see you guys in the chat. What game should I try to have on in the corner? Is there anything worth watching right now? Probably should flip to USC. The USC game because that one was at the half when I put this on, and it is now back to a one-score game. East Coaster, it's hard to watch USC. It's hard to do it when you do the live show. Josh Natter, with no more undefeated G5 teams, who do we think is the G5 New York 6 representative? Oh, that is a good question. Who is the New Year 6 representative? Well, I mean, BYU still has the inside track on that. And I'll say if Daniel was here, he'd be doing a little dance, spinning in his chair, because he said for a couple of weeks now that he thought Arkansas was going to beat BYU, and he thought it might be by a significant margin. He wasn't wrong. There was a point early in the season, particularly when they beat Baylor. I don't know why, but BYU fans were all over us on Twitter that their team was the greatest team since sliced bread. And, you know, it's tough to play with the big boys. Playing a team like Arkansas, who's going to be lucky to have a winning record in the SEC, they're still a good football team. I mean, the Big Ten East, the SEC West are brutal. And I don't think people always understand what that really means. Right now, trying to look, Cincinnati. Yeah, Cincinnati's sitting there at 5-1. I think we talked about this before, that if they had beaten Arkansas, they had a good chance to go undefeated. They play SMU, UCF, Navy, East Carolina, Temple, Tulane. None of those teams are particularly good. UCF might be the best of them. My guess would be Cincinnati is going to be where your G5 rep is going to be. And I'll note here, Daniel, I said is gone. So for people that just joined in the chat, yep, he's gone. To be less, hide the ball a little bit less. He's with his kids on vacation. So he definitely deserves it. And, we guys, as much as we like doing the live show, we can't necessarily block off every weekend for a hobby. So he's out there taking his wife and kids out on a trip. And I think they may be getting on a boat here before too long. One last Michigan Penn State thought. Josh, please, what is your explanation on how Michigan has more sacks this year than at the same point in last year? It's secondary. If your secondary covers well, it's easier to get pressure. And last year their secondary was good, but this year I think their secondary is better. I think Aiden Hutchinson's a very good player, but you get sometimes more sacks out of interior pass rush and linebacker play and just overall DB play than you do line play. And I think that's the difference right now with Michigan and where their defense is really just the overall quality of play. And I will also say, quite frankly, the fact that they've gotten up to big leads and that they've been playing inferior offenses does a lot for you. Because when you make Iowa or Penn State pass, you get sacks. When you don't have an offense that can make them pass, then they're going to keep running the ball and you don't get sacks. So that's, I think, the other part of it. And that's why statistics in college football are helpful to a large degree to sort of verify what your eyes see. But I don't necessarily take someone as being the sack leader as necessarily being the best pass rusher. And I think that's a pretty good points with it. Someone asked about, again, this conversation came up, and I think it's an interesting one. Where would I rank the quarterbacks if I was an NFL exec right now? And I think right now I would probably have Stroud as my number one pick at quarterback. A lot of it has to do with build, actually. I think Bryce Young in some ways may end up being a better college quarterback than he is an NFL quarterback. And I'm not sure that he isn't a better college quarterback. I think he may be a better college quarterback on a worse team, but that's super debatable because they're very different passers. But Stroud, what makes him different is he's taller and he has a snappier deep release. And he can make those long point throws that I think Bryce sometimes doesn't. I don't know that he has the arm strength on those deeper throws to really drive them the same way Stroud does. What Bryce excels is in the short game, particularly making off-angle throws. He's got some Patrick Mahomes in him within 10 to 15 yards, if you understand what I mean by that. He doesn't have Mahomes' arm, but his ability to flick his wrist and quickly deliver the ball on a line opposite his body is rare, as his ability to get his eyes downfield, dance around in the backfield, that kind of thing. But those two guys are really number one, number two. I would personally probably draft Stroud ahead of Bryce because I think Bryce is so short, frankly. That's why Alabama, I think, is in the shotgun all the time because he can't see over the line. And it's a lot easier to see downfield if you're out of shotgun, if you're trying to see over a line. Where if you're right here in the line of scrimmage, you can't always see the lineman right in front of you. So I think that gives Stroud some advantages. I think Hooker is very good. He is very athletic in an underrated degree. He throws a great deep ball. He is running a system. And I've seen him play at Virginia Tech. I've seen him play at Tennessee. He has been good. Even tonight, he threw an interception that was just a bad throw. He overthrew some deep balls that could have given them scores, and I think probably drives and scored anyway. But those plays can be negative more in the NFL. I do think those guys are probably your top three near NFL draft picks. Quinn Ewers is an insane talent, but again, right now he's a redshirt freshman, and I think by the end of the year he's going to look different than he does today, and next year he's going to look even further different than he does right now. So he needs a lot more time in the oven, I think, to make a real evaluation there. Somebody asked whose offense is better, Tennessee or Ohio State. I would probably say Ohio State's is better. They're more talented, certainly the skill positions. Tennessee's receivers are legit now. I mean, that is an NFL receiving core. Hyatt is going to be probably a high round draft pick. The crazy thing is Cedric Tillman didn't even play, and he's probably their best wide receiver. Now, their other wide receivers, though, aren't so hot. Now, this is where scheme comes in, right? Tennessee didn't really rely too much on the rest of the receiving core. Their big plays all mostly went through Hyatt, and that was because they were able to scheme it one-on-one. Ohio State can line up and throw it to anybody they want to, but they're not going to do it out of the same scheme. And I think, weirdly, Alabama's scheme, given the schematic problems they have, you want to take that example, Alabama would play better defense against Ohio State, even though Ohio State's a better offense. it's a matchup and scheme issue, and Alabama just did not adjust at all to Tennessee's scheme. And I'm not sure they really can. I'm not sure if it's a flaw in the way their defense is built or not. But I do think overall, Ohio State's better. They've got better players. But give props to Tennessee, and certainly give props. The big question mark there is that Tennessee offensive line this year has just been legit. And I still don't quite know how good they are versus how bad maybe LSU and Alabama are, but those don't, that's just something we're going to have to figure out down the road. All right, other games. So the next game I want to talk on here, since I'm not seeing any super chats, man, I guess I'm just not as good looking as Daniel. I don't get the dollar bills thrown at me. The Texas game. Texas game was interesting. Went down to the wire. Iowa State had plenty of opportunity to win that game. They did not, and Texas holds on. And, we started with this a little bit talking about Ewers, but I just want to briefly talk about the game and how it went. I'm looking at the wrong one. Ewers' statistics in that game are, pretty insane from a per play standpoint in certain ways. But really that game more than anything for Texas was about efficiency, and it was about Bijan Robinson. He ran had 28 carries for 135 yards. That's not absolutely insane average, but you're running about 5 yards a carry, and the things they did it against loaded boxes. Ewers was 172 yards on 26 passes. Math is hard, so I'm going to just type that in. That's about 6. Is that right? No, that can't be right. 172 yards, 26 passes only comes out to about 6.7 yards per attempt. Not the best numbers there. Threw 3 touchdowns, had a high QBR. I almost feel like this box score. It's ESPN's is wrong, but I guess that is right. Didn't feel like it watching it. Deckers threw for 329 yards, but they only had 74 yards rushing. And that was really the key to it, is that Texas is a big physical defense. They play good defense. You can beat them through the air, I think, if you're efficient, particularly if you play small ball. They do tend to struggle a little bit with throws underneath and sort of, I think, short area quickness game, they can get beat. And certainly Iowa State had to earn a lot of their production. But the big thing with Texas is they're very physical. And if you can take away the run, again, it makes a lot of other things easier for you defensively. And then Texas can win with a run, which makes a lot of things way easier for them offensively. And that's sort of the story of them as a football team and where they're at. I think as long as they are as herky-jerky as they are today against better defenses, they're always going to be in a little bit of trouble. But that run game, if they can stay healthy between the two Robinsons there, you're going to be able to continue to run the football and stay ahead of down and distance and have a pretty good result on that side of the ball. Alex Rydell asked a hypothetical Ohio State versus other top 10 teams. That's interesting. Right now, so let me look at the current top 10. But I'm trying to think through it. We already talked a little bit about where they would be, I think, versus Michigan. So I'm going to skip that one. Alabama right now, I think they beat Alabama. Their combination of playing good defense, which again, Alabama lacks explosiveness. So they're going to have to drive the field on Ohio State, and that's going to be a real struggle. And defensively, Alabama has to deal with the fact that Ohio State can march 3 or 4 wide receivers up there at a time that are all very high-level players that can all block. And that just becomes a pick their poison situation. They can do a lot of the same things Tennessee did to Alabama, which is, again, people scoffed at this. Alabama does have probably 3+ first-round draft picks in that secondary, but they ain't all starting at the same time. And the thing is, if you can put out 4 great wide receivers, you can just throw repeatedly at the 2 guys that aren't first-round draft picks, and you can ignore the rest. That's the advantage an offense has over a defense. Ohio State would be able to leverage that. The other big thing is really just the pass rush, right? Ohio State's offensive line is good. Ohio State can run the ball. That will keep Alabama honest. I'll be curious to see how that changes from Alabama. Maybe it's weird, right? Because Alabama's offense was on fire and the defense was awful. And then last week against Texas A&M, I get it's not a good offense, but 5.4 yards per attempt, they dominated defensively. The offense couldn't move the ball. Texas game, for most of it, the defense was dominant. Couldn't move the ball. I get the first quarter, but for the rest of the game, they shut everybody down, and they had for weeks. I don't know what Alabama is. Either the offense is great or the defense is great, but never at the same time. Is that a reflection of the teams they're playing, or is it just inconsistency for them as a team and a program? I don't know, but it makes the projection harder. The next toughest one would be Ohio State versus Clemson. And the short answer there is I think Ohio State is going to score points in everybody, and I'm not sure Clemson really is. Clemson's offense is a lot better than they were last year. That showed certainly against Florida State. I've talked about this several times now. They move the ball pretty well. Uiagalelei is not really lighting anything on fire, but their scheme's a little bit better. They use him better as a runner. Their run game, importantly, is greatly improved, which just makes everything flow. Even if you're not great in the passing game, if you can take shots and not need to complete it, it changes the complexion of things. So Clemson can move the ball a little bit, but Ohio State's a lot better defensively than Florida State. And certainly offensively, they're a lot better. And I think Clemson's defense has been a little bit disappointing. The back seven for them is solid, but not a whole lot more than that. They do have a good front. They can get some pressure. That's not enough to keep Ohio State from scoring 30 points. And I just don't think they would match up that well. You go down the rest of it, you talk about Tennessee, and right now the way Tennessee's clicking, any game with them is going to be a barn burner. And I would probably pick Ohio State, but if you play a team that has an offense like that, they can win every game, even if their defense means they could lose every game. Same thing with USC, really in the same boat. And you could go kind of move down the list. I think the rest of them, like Ole Miss and so on, aren't quite the same quality of team, and you get a little bit more unrealistic. Someone asked if you had to pick a winner for Tennessee, Georgia today, who would it be? Whew! I talked about that earlier. That is a tough question to answer. Tennessee did rout the mighty Commodores of Vanderbilt today, which everybody was high on them when they beat Hawaii, one of the worst football teams in recent memory, and suddenly that they don't look so hot. Georgia is a really physical football team. They have a great offensive line. They have a great defense across the board. They are very physical defensively. I flagged at the beginning of the year. The thing that I said was maybe Alabama's Achilles heel is I thought they had a lot of solid defensive linemen. I don't think they have a lot of elite ones. I'm not talking about edge rushers. I'm talking D linemen. I think that showed today. Their defensive linemen couldn't really just stuff the run. They're playing a freshman, Otis, 91, for a lot of the game because he's 340 pounds. Maybe he's a really good player down the road, but that's kind of the best they got. Georgia has really good linemen. Now, Jalen Carter went out, but their fronts, because they're so much more physical, they're going to be able to play Tennessee a lot more honestly and then probably put more DBs on the field. They're also going to get the advantage of watching that Alabama tape and maybe learning some lessons. So it's tough. I think I would take Georgia. But they do a lot of the same stuff that gave Georgia fits last year. Georgia's defense schematically very similar to Alabama's and what they do and how they do it. Offensively, Georgia wants to run the ball, and Tennessee's not good at pass defense, but they're great against the run. Georgia would have to dink and dunk down the field the way Alabama did. Stetson Bennett has not been so good at doing that. It's tough. I think it'd be a very close game. I'd pick it just as close as I would pick Tennessee, Alabama again in a rematch. For sure, Tennessee has a very legitimate chance at winning the SEC East and winning the SEC this year. I don't think that is one thing I'll say. I don't think that's a fluke result. I think Tennessee is quite good. It's hard to see anybody but Georgia in the SEC East beating them. I will say that. Somebody, Alex Rydell, I like that. Ohio State versus Georgia scores in the chat. That's if you guys want to come up with something fun to put down, that's the two things I'd like to see. What do you think the score would be if Ohio State played Tennessee, and what do you think it'd be if Ohio State played Georgia? Just give me those two scores. Gator Sean said, thanks for the show, Josh. I appreciate it. I'm glad to do it. It's kind of fun. And it's always fun when you guys jump in and enjoy what we're doing. Jabari Williams just said, Daniel isn't better looking. We just don't want to throw too much at you yet. I get it. But the super chats do help me keep on topic or on a topic. Benjamin V, trying to catch up a little bit, said, feels like McCarthy is hitting deep ball and avoiding forcing it away for elite. Let's see if I can make sure I read this right. I respect you guys a ton, but don't understand why you were so low on him. I mean, I'm not that low. It's just a matter of how you evaluate somebody that's playing top 10 football, right? I mean, if you just watched Hendon Hooker play Alabama, there weren't a lot of misses, and there are a lot of quick throws being made accurately to good reads in that game. McCarthy isn't quite there yet, right? 24 passes, 145 attempts, 0 touchdowns, 1 interception. He's trying not to throw interceptions. He's trying to be careful with the football. The extension of that is he's doing it because he's not sure if he's going to. Hooker has thrown 1 interception this year. 1. Tossing it down the field constantly. That's high-level top 5 team quarterback play. CJ Stroud lights teams up. And you can do that only when you're confident in your reads and your execution. And McCarthy's just not there yet. He's not always sure what he should be doing. And so it kind of puts a limiter on how much he can accomplish. Now, his athleticism is a huge plus for Michigan. How he fits into that scheme is a huge plus. But he's just not quite at the same level as those other guys do. So I'm not like super duper low on him. But when you compared him and Clifford, they're really 2 very different guys. Clifford does a great job of getting Penn State set before the snap. He does. Snaps the ball, and then it's sort of what can he accomplish with who he is as a talent. McCarthy is a great talent, but he's not fully developed yet. And sometimes that Michigan scheme is a ceiling may be very high, but the ability to operate it can be pretty challenging, and it can be a little limiting on a quarterback unless you can operate it at a very, very high level. Mike Farino, again, just staying on top of super chats. Bama's defense reminds me a ton of last year's Ohio State defense, though obviously better overall. Against lesser talent, they can absolutely dominate, but when talent is similar, they have major issues exposed. I mean, that may be true. That may be true of what they are. And again, that's because when you get to a point, we talk about stressors offensively. We've talked about it in a lot of different contexts over the years. When you get to a certain point, you play certain offense as a defense, and Michigan kept running into this with Brown as a defensive coordinator. There are things you're doing that work great, blitzing and being aggressive, because you can play tight coverage, and they only have so many weapons that they can use, and things work. And then suddenly you play a really high-level offense, and now they can spread you out and run the ball and throw to this guy and throw to that guy. And because you get more spread out, because they can throw the ball deeper on you, you get way more isolated. And the big advantage with an offense is they can pick where they want to go with the ball. A defense is usually as bad as its worst player. And that's, I think, the story of the Alabama game today. I mean, that Alabama team, they got like 5 first-round draft picks on defense. They do. And they were terrible because those guys weren't the ones that Tennessee was targeting. They were targeting the other dudes. Your offense is always really as good as your best player. And so I think that's sort of the story between those teams and where they are and why, maybe those comparisons do line up a little bit. Because last year, Ohio State had some things where they just weren't great at certain positions. The defensive line couldn't get a ton of push against better teams. And when you can't get push, really pressure and push from your defensive front dictates a little bit what the offense can do, because it alters timing. It forces quicker throws. If you give the offense time, they're able to get the guy they want to where they want against who they want. And Alabama, I think it's true. Alabama has the same sorts of problems. David Bonner missed the start of the live stream, so this may have already been talked about. For as good as Michigan was running the ball, we had a lot of problems finishing drives. Go Blue. O-line was very impressive. And I think that honestly it comes down to the fact that playing in a compressed field is very different. The RPO goes away in a compressed field. And Corum was really explosive because Michigan has good enough players on the outside that they were able to spread Penn State out. And that opened up running lanes. It opened up edges. It meant if Corum could get through the first line, he could get some space on linebackers and safeties. And when you start playing near the end zone, they can creep those safeties up. They compress the field, and you don't get as much space. And I think the difficulty that brings in terms of, one, you can't really run the RPO anymore, and that means the safeties can play run, and now suddenly the run game gets harder. And if they're good enough against the run, that means it depends a lot more on the consistency, accuracy, quick release, and timing, the quarterback, and that's where McCarthy isn't as strong, to get back to an earlier conversation. So I think that's how I can kind of put it together. And Javari Williams said, my last super chat of the night, LOL. And I appreciate it, Javari. You've been extremely generous tonight. And this is a labor of love for us, so we appreciate it. And, this stuff, it makes it worth our time, frankly, but it also just really kind of makes it fun. This one is for all my Michigan fans. We're not going to be able to just run it down Ohio State's throats this year. We need more snaps. luckily for us, we have the time and the schedule to improve. And I think that goes back to what I was saying. McCarthy, as I think Javari Williams is getting at, McCarthy is a really talented player, and he's getting there, but he's not quite there yet. And I think Michigan is only going to continue to improve offensively the same way they did at the end of last year. Seems at this point pretty obvious that losing Gaddis was addition by subtraction. And as they kind of move further and further away from that, I think you're going to see them be a better and better team. Defenses. Ultra said, Josh, would you still say Bama defense is the best of the country as of this moment? If not, who would that be? At this moment, it's hard to say that. Surely hard to say that. After watching that performance, it seems like they have some big Achilles heels. That's still a very good defense. And we talked early on in the live stream, if you missed it, sort of why it was to some degree more schematic than personnel driven, what Tennessee was able to do in that game. But I haven't seen any indication that Georgia has the same shortcomings. Iowa's defense has been playing lights out, but I think this would be a totally different type of game and they could get exposed to. I'm probably going to go with Georgia as being the next best defense. Look, good defenses are driven by great talent, and there's only one team in the country that really rivals Alabama's talent on the defensive side of the ball, maybe even surpasses it, and that is Georgia. Their recruiting has been stellar. Ohio State's has been stellar as well, and I think you can see that starting to reflect heavily in the defense, but they're not quite where their standard wants them to be this year. They're a lot further along than they were last year, but I don't know that they're quite there. Ellis Matt said, as a Penn State fan, I agree. The expectation of being elite when we aren't is annoying. My question is, how far off do you think we are as a program from reaching that? And I think the answer is you're 1 to 2 top 5 recruiting classes from reaching that. You're not going to be able to play at the level that Penn State fans want you to be able to play at without having that kind of recruiting class under your belt. And they've had good recruiting classes, but maybe just not quite at that level. You got to get better skill position talent. You got to get faster and more athletic on the defensive side of the ball. And you've got great players. They generally very well coached on the defensive side of the ball. I think offensively, I will say I've never felt like Franklin has a strong identity. It just feels like they've got modern concepts they kind of throw out with some semblance of an identity built around the RPO and the power run, but it's not as clearly driven as, say, like USC that I'm watching right now against Utah. It's very clear what their system is and how they build plays and how they structure it and layer things. And I don't see that as well out of Penn State, but it's hard to do when you don't have matchup advantages you can clearly draw on. And I'm not sure that Penn State has those. That, frankly, is just a reflection of recruiting. Jake Glassman, who's your pick right now for Georgia and Tennessee? And I'll say that, Jake, I think I covered that a minute ago, but I'll repeat it. Right now, between Georgia and Tennessee, I would probably pick Georgia. I think their defense hasn't shown there's not really been any sign that they have the same flaws that Tennessee just exposed against Alabama. I think their offense is as consistent, maybe more efficient and consistent than Alabama. I don't know that they're as good in the passing game, certainly, as Alabama is right now. Bryce Young was dealing in that game, despite not getting a ton of help. They didn't get a lot of yardage on first down, was the big thing. Georgia's going to get much better yardage on first down and second down running the ball, and they just create a lot of building pressure, and that's tough. And frankly, if I had to pick Tennessee and Alabama to play again in 2 weeks, I virtually guarantee you Alabama is going to do some things to change up the way they play defense, and they're going to be far more effective. And in that same regard, I don't think Georgia is going to get burned the same way Alabama just was. They're going to take them a lot more seriously. Oh, me. So I've gone through those. I'm going to try to hit up a couple scores here, and then I'm probably going to jump into my top 10 guys. So let me see here. Pull up my scoreboard. Next one on my list that I want to talk about real quick is that LSU Florida game. I think that was a pretty fun game to keep an eye on. If I can actually get the box score pulled up. But the surprising thing I think to that one is how high scoring it was, right? And maybe that's something to be said about Tennessee and LSU. I think I was right when I was talking about the previews and you had to throw out the Tennessee LSU game. That LSU offense is a lot better than they were against Tennessee because they lost 2 linemen the day of the game, their entire left side of the offensive line. they're just a much better team with those guys back. Jalen Daniels did go off, 349 yards passing. They had 179 yards rushing. They really ran the ball and passed the ball with great success. And I think the interesting thing to me really is that Florida themselves had a lot of success. They ran the ball okay. It was 210 yards, but it's deceptive because Anthony Richardson had a couple big runs, including an 80-yarder. They really inflated that number more than it was. It was more like 100 yards rushing plus a huge quarterback play. And they threw the ball okay, like 7 yards an attempt. But LSU, I think, is a solid football team. I think Florida probably is a bad football team. It's still kind of shocking to me that they beat Utah. Probably says a lot about Utah. The biggest thing for me is that LSU looks week by week a little bit more coherent, a little bit more consistent. I think the defense and that secondary was highly rated by a lot of people just on historical reputation. They lose McLaurin, who's in Arkansas. They lose Eli Ricks, who's on the bench in Alabama. And, they're not the same unit as they were. They struggle a bit in coverage. They get lost sometimes. It's not a great secondary. It's a pretty active front with good pass rushers. But the big thing is that offense, when it's clicking, it's got a lot of weapons, a lot of great, they got a handful of great running backs. They've got a really mobile quarterback. Butte, this game finally sort of woke up, had over 100 yards receiving. They can be a very dangerous football team, and that's an interesting one going forward. The next one on my list is the Clemson game with Florida State, and Clemson pulled away. I've already covered that, so I'm not going to go into it too far, but I will say, again, that I think Clemson is waking up. And I've said since the onset of the year, Clemson is a team that's capable of playing with the elites, especially due to the talent they have on defense and some of the talent they have on offense. They're the one team that I felt like was capable of kind of climbing into that tier. And they're week by week, I feel like they get a little closer to it. Other points in the year before I get into my top 10, NC State goes down. NC State was playing Syracuse. Syracuse is ranked, I think, undefeated for the first time in a long time. Now, a lot of that is scheduled for Syracuse, and I will say NC State loses their starting quarterback. I think Leary is underrated nationally. I don't think NC State's a great team. I think Leary carries them to a large degree. And without Leary, they just had no offense. I don't take a whole lot more from it than that. That just kind of knocked them out. And finally, the big game that we have not talked about at all really was the TCU Oklahoma State game. I will confess I did not get to watch this game a ton. I can only watch so many games live at once. I did have it on, but I wasn't able to focus on it due to other things were going on at the same time. But the thing I will say is TCU continues to put out really good offensive numbers. Wasn't the same clip they had, but still over almost 300 yards passing, over 200 yards rushing, which was sort of the big deal. Spencer Sanders played a Spencer Sanders game, which was below 50% passing. I know this is another one of those guys that I'm not as high on as others, and it's because people say he's an inconsistent quarterback, but I'm telling you, he's inconsistent in games where teams make him inconsistent. This is a great example of it. He had some yards rushing, but he wasn't particularly effective as a passer. Oklahoma State was in a position to put this game away. They failed to do so because their offense kind of sputtered. The defense isn't great. Neither one of these defenses, frankly, is great. I'll probably be reflected in my top 10 a little bit. But TCU did pull off the win. And at this point, being 6-0 is undefeated. And obviously being 6-0 is an accomplishment. That's what I mean. Blowing out Oklahoma, defeating Kansas, beating Oklahoma State. Any of those in isolation is a pretty good accomplishment. Doing all of them back to back to back is a big deal. And that's what TCU's done. They continue to win. They have a tough game in a week from now against Kansas State. They still have Texas and Texas Tech looming on their schedule. Those are tough games. And then Baylor to end the year. So there's a lot ahead of TCU. It's going to be tough for them to run the table. But if they do, they're going to, frankly, they probably utterly deserve to be in the playoff conversation, not just because of the fact that they're undefeated, but if you can run the table with this schedule, playing the round robin like they do in the Big 12, it's a serious accomplishment. I think, just spoiler alert, I don't think they probably will, but that should be said later. Last comment before I get into my top 10. Yum Yum said, wondering what Knoxville bar the goalpost ended up in. And I think that's a tough question. So I've been to Knoxville and Neyland Stadium right there on the river. I think it's more likely that the goalposts are floating down the river somewhere. I have seen a goalpost thrown off the upper deck of a stadium. Fun fact. Still always wondered if somebody died when that happened. But yeah, they're probably going to be disassembled, and a piece of it's going to be in every bar in Knoxville. It's going to be all anybody talks about for a long time. But that's an interesting conversation because, again, if Alabama takes care of business, either Tennessee is going to have to play Alabama again, or Tennessee is not going to lose to Georgia and not go to the SEC title. Maybe they make the playoff as a one-loss team that didn't make the conference champion. Is kind of the best way to make the playoff as a non-champion. But otherwise, yeah, you either figure they're probably going to face Alabama again, or they're just not going to be able to hit their goals for the year overall. But yeah, I just feel like we're not at the end of that story with Alabama and Tennessee. I'll say that. So give me just a moment. Drink me a glass of water, and we're gonna get into the top 10. Whew. Cam Rising just discovered gravity in a very forceful way at the hands of a USC defender. Oh, Jake Harrell said, "Yep, it's in the river." So I was right. Does that mean do I win? Do I win a cookie? Do I get a gold star? I guessed it would end up being in the river. It just seemed like the natural thing. People go, "Ooh, there's water," and they move towards it, and then I don't know. Somebody's floating down the Tennessee River on a goalpost. Okay, guys. All right. So now this is my weekly top 10. Again, Daniel's off on vacation, running around with his kids. I get to hold point by myself, but I think we can do it. So let's jump into it and talk about my top 10 for the week. My number one, as it has been for weeks and should remain, is Ohio State. Ohio State is playing complete football. I have no reason to dock them. They don't need to do anything for me to keep them number one. Offensively, they have every bit of skill position talent that Tennessee has and better. They have a great quarterback that's playing higher level football. But unlike Tennessee, they have a good defense. And so they are the one, I think, right now, complete package that can play and stress you in every aspect offensively, which is very important in the modern era of football. And then defensively, they have a defense to complement it. And I don't think anyone else can quite match that. My number two, as of right now, is Georgia. Georgia is not as fancy or flashy as Ohio State, but they are sneakily maybe just as good from a pro angle. They've got great running backs. They have one of the best tight end rooms in years. They have solid receivers, and they have solid quarterback play for efficiency football. What they don't have is the same level of explosiveness that Ohio State has. And even though I think their defense is better and they continue to play at a high level, Vanderbilt is a bad team, but they're a bad team actually with a sneakily good offense. Georgia just shut them down like it was nothing. And that's what Georgia is. I think in the college game with college rules and the RPO, as I said, from an NFL perspective, they may be as talented as Ohio State. From a college perspective, where wide receiver is king, where the vertical passing game is so important, I know it matters in the NFL, but here, that is what wins you football games. And they're just not as explosive as Ohio State. And so right now, I think Ohio State is the better football team. My number three is Michigan. And you look, man, all they do is beat the teams in front of them. They played what I think is a pretty darn good Penn State team. I don't know that they're completely sold that Penn State's a top 10 quality team. I wasn't sold on that last week, but they blew them out, and they did it on the ground in an impressive fashion. Defensively, Michigan looks as good, maybe even better than they did last year. And if you can ground and pound like they do, if you can play efficiency football and they keep finding more and more ways to be explosive offensively, you pair that with a high-level defense, and you've got a playoff caliber team. It's just unfortunate for them that they got Ohio State in front of them. My number four is Tennessee. I already had Tennessee floating around, I think somewhere around number 6 last week in my top 10, and obviously beating Alabama moves you up. The way I always do my criteria is to talk about, how did you do against your schedule and how would someone else have done against their schedule? Off that metric, I considered putting Tennessee ahead of Michigan. I strongly considered it. They blew out LSU, who I think is a pretty good football team. They just beat Alabama. Beating a top 3 team is something that no one else has done this year, or legit top 5 quality team, and they did it straight up. Tennessee is a great football team, but the LSU game has an asterisk because LSU did sort of have an implosion. They lost the whole left side of the line. As of that game, the left tackle was ill and hospitalized. The left guard goes out in the first quarter. they implode. So really, I'm kind of evaluating Tennessee almost entirely on that Alabama game. And here's my problem. They don't have the defense that Michigan has or Georgia has or Ohio State has. They've got to win a shootout. And just like when we would rank Oklahoma years ago, I can only rank you so high if you're only good on one side of the ball. That's where Tennessee is right now. They can play with anyone with that offense, just like Oklahoma could way back in around 2018, even down in 2019. But just like we saw, Oklahoma plays LSU in 2019, they can't stay with them because suddenly you've got to score, and you've got to stop them from scoring. And suddenly you end up on the wrong side of the avalanche facing a good defense. But probably more like 2018 where they played Alabama. Their offense looked great in that game, but all it took was 3 sputter drives at the beginning of the game to put them in a hole they couldn't possibly dig out of because Alabama scored almost every possession that game. That's my problem with Tennessee compared to the ones in front of them. My next team, number 5, is Clemson. Clemson continues to play undefeated football. The best thing I can say. The defense is very good. The offense is improving. They have a run game now. They have a semblance of a passing game. And if they can have that to complement a defense, they are a very good football team. And importantly, they go out and they handle business against what is a pretty darn good Florida State team. And that's something I can't say about my number 6 team. That team is Alabama. And Alabama's tough because they got a loss. Some of the teams behind them right now in my ranking don't have losses yet. But here's the deal. Playing Texas and beating them, I think Texas is a top 10 quality team. They had problems. Hudson Card gets injured. They still won that game. I don't know how much of a big deal it is or isn't to beat Texas A&M. That's a top 5 or top 6 team in terms of talent. That's also a team that has a lot of issues, but they found a way to win that game. And even the Tennessee game, they lose in a last-second field goal where they dig themselves out of a hole. And when you look at the teams behind them, there's nobody behind them that I'm going to pick to beat them. And I don't know that there are many teams behind them that I would expect to go 2-0 versus Texas and Tennessee either. So it's hard for me to drop Alabama a lot further than that. I also think, push comes to shove, Alabama's going to continue to play good football. And as you've heard a lot of people say this, and I believe Josh Pate's another one that said it, Alabama has the potential, due to the talent on that roster, to be the best football team overall at the end of the year. I still see that. I agree with him on that point. The receivers are young, but I will say this game, the reason Alabama kept pace is those young receivers, Prentice and Bond in particular, 2 freshmen, showed up. And if Alabama starts getting real production out of those freshmen, and you're starting to see guys like Burden and Holden for them start to fade into the background, they're going to take some big steps forward as a football team. And if they can figure out whatever imploded defensively, they've got a shot to absolutely be a shot to make the playoffs and then win it. But they've got their work cut out for them. My number 7, and I will say this is tenuous. So if they lose, understand it, it's USC. They are currently winning by 7 against Utah. Utah is currently driving in the fourth quarter to tie the game. By the time this video releases, Utah may have won. You can throw this out. Sorry. I have to assume USC wins the game. I got to do a top 10. I'm on the East Coast, and I cannot wait till 1 a.m. to do this top 10 to see what happens in this game. So right now, I think their offense is very good. They've really kind of blew up early against Utah, and they've shown really what makes Lincoln Riley special as a play caller, and combining it with Addison, who got banged up and was in the injury tent a minute ago. Quarterback play from Caleb Williams that I think is high level, but still shows some of the sort of spottiness that you get from him as a football player. And so you end up with a USC team that I think sort of tenuously holds on to that 7 spot. My number 8 right behind him is a team that I think is sneakily similar, and that's Ole Miss. Ole Miss struggled early and really all through the game to put away Auburn. They constantly had a lead. They constantly couldn't stop Auburn offensively. Auburn has a good rushing attack. They've got one of by far the best running backs in the country in Tank Bigsby, who unfortunately for him has to do almost everything by himself. Auburn has figured out a little bit of what they want to do with Robbie Ashford. You could tell in that game versus Ole Miss, but Ole Miss still got just gouged defensively. They have not played great competition to this point. Their offense looked good against Auburn, and Auburn is a good defense, and they moved the ball pretty darn well. Jackson Dart played good football. He was throwing it well, actually ran it some. They've got balance in the run game. They got weapons like Zach Evans. They've got a solid receiving core. I like Ole Miss. I'm not necessarily sold that they're going to stay here. But right now, with where they're at, with them being undefeated, you have to leave them there until they actually lose a game. And I think, even right now I can see in the chat, people talk about UCLA is better than USC and Ole Miss, or Ole Miss is going to lose to A&M. Like, I don't really think like Ole Miss is going to stay undefeated. In fact, I think they're going to drop 2 to 4 games this year because they've got a pretty backloaded schedule. They've got all the good teams in the SEC West are still to play, and I think they're going to drop some. But right now, undefeated, I got to put them there. Next for me is TCU. I almost feel bad not putting TCU higher, but they're a really similar team to Ole Miss and USC. Again, these teams are all kind of sitting there with the same profile. Duggan continues to play high-level quarterback play. Defensively, they are somewhat suspect and shaky, just like USC and Ole Miss. But I will say they are just way under the radar good. There were a lot of people felt like statistically they were the best offense in the country. And what I mean by that, if you looked at certain statistics and certain metrics, they were either the best or one of the best offenses in the country. They are way faster and more athletic than I think a lot of people realize if you haven't really watched them. They have the ability to have balance. They are getting good quarterback play. They've got every piece you want to have. My concern is frankly, this year, I don't think the Big 12 is playing very good defense. That's not just a trope. The old early 2010 days when they were all playing RPO and the rest of the conferences weren't, and they said, look, if you had to play RPO every day like we do, you'd look bad too. There was some merit to that, which SEC fans don't want to admit, like the Oklahoma State year where they're left off in 2011. I don't think they're beating Alabama and LSU because of how good those teams were, but there's something to be said that those teams, Alabama and LSU teams, never really had to face a true RPO team. That's not true anymore. Everybody's running the RPO. There's nothing special about what's happening in the Big 12 offensively. Their defenses are just kind of bad. And I think Texas is kind of the one exception. TCU's defense is fine, but it's not great. And that's why I right now have them behind USC and Ole Miss. My number 10 is UCLA. And people were mentioning them in the chat. My problem with UCLA is I'm also just not convinced of what they've done to date. So USC and UCLA have the same problem, really, and it's a reflection of my honest opinion, which is I don't think the Pac-12 is that great. But they're undefeated teams. They all happen to have magically not played each other yet. That'll sort itself out at the end of the year. Like, you go through UCLA schedule. Bowling Green is really bad this year. Alabama State, FCS team. South Alabama, converted FCS team that's not great. By the way, you beat them by 1 point, 32-31. Colorado is awful this year. Washington is not a great team, and you won by a touchdown. Utah, I don't really think Utah is that great of a team. You beat them by 10. And I say this as Utah is right now trying to tie the game with USC. But this is the problem. There's this whole mix of USC, UCLA, Utah teams that are all floating around 10 through like 20 to 24. I'm not sure how many of these teams would really be that high in my ranking if they played in a different conference. I'm not sure what their records would be in a different conference, but it's hard for me to leave undefeated teams out of the top 10. I do think UCLA's run game is legit. What they do with Charbonnet is phenomenal. If you're a Michigan fan, man, you got to be drooling over the fact that you could have had Corum and Charbonnet in the backfield at the same time, rotating between those two. It's an absolute shame that Michigan lost him because just in view of who Michigan could have been. But that's my top 10. I will say the interesting one to me that's floating outside the top 10, and I talked about this earlier on in our live show when I record this on Saturdays, is Texas. I think Texas is probably a top 10 quality team. I think with Quinn Ewers, who they are right now, if they had been that way all year, they would be a top 10 team. And I don't know how the Alabama game would go, and people never understand what we mean by when we say this. If Ewers is in the game, they're going to have to get out of script. They're going to have to play an Alabama defense that replaced a couple DBs right when Ewers went out because they had some guys getting beat. And Alabama would be responding offensively to what Texas is doing. I don't know how that game goes. If you want to say Texas probably wins, I'm not going to argue with you. But it's hard to make an assumption of how that game turns out. The bigger thing to me, the Texas Tech loss is the reason they're not in my top 10. Texas Tech is a solid team. I think they're reasonably good, maybe sneakily good. They're pretty solid. You shouldn't be a top 10 team and lose to them for your second loss. And so they're being held out. But that you can chalk that up to the fact that Hudson Card was out there on a tweaked ankle. And, Ewers is unavailable. And maybe, I mean, that probably is why they lost that game. Even though the defense did fold late in the heat, it was probably would have pulled it out anyway with a better quarterback situation. So Texas is sort of an interesting caveat to me, because they're one that I feel like I have to leave out because they've got 2 losses. But there's a big part of me that wants to excuse the situation due to quarterback injuries, which I always say quarterback injury is the one excuse that's valid, especially in college football, where you don't have a lot of reps and almost no one has quality backup quarterbacks. You get an injured quarterback for a game or two and you lose a game or two, you got to make a lot of exceptions for it. And so there's an argument for me to putting Texas in the top 10. That's it. So that's my top 10 for the week. Again, major props for Tennessee on their big win over Alabama. Alabama falls back. But I will say virtually everyone in this top 10, in fact, everyone in this top 10 controls their own destiny. If any one of these teams wins out, they're going to make the college football playoff. The only exception is if you somehow get an SEC, ACC, all Power 5 champions that are all undefeated or one has one loss. Obviously, somebody has to be left out. But other than that, you still got 10 teams that all control their own fate, and they can all win their conference title and all be in a prime position to be what would normally be considered an automatic playoff candidate. So with that, guys, it is about 11:15 here, and I am probably going to wrap up my live show because I don't know what else to talk about. If you guys have any lingering questions, I'll stay on for a minute or two and watch the live chat and try to answer anything you guys have trailing left. Someone asked, can Bama make the playoff? And I know the feed's a little behind, so I think I'd actually just answered that. Yeah, they absolutely can. If Alabama wins out and they beat Georgia, I don't care if they're undefeated conference champions. If you can win out in the SEC and you're going to have to beat a top 3 team in the SEC championship game, maybe the number 1 team in the country in the SEC championship game, they're not going to put a Big 12 or a Pac-12 champion in over that team. And with Alabama in particular, they've beaten Texas. It may well be that Texas wins the Big 12. If that happens, it's a 2-loss champion that's already lost to Alabama. Yeah, Alabama's in. There's no way. You're only going to find 3 other conferences then that can have an undefeated champion, and Alabama's going to take the 4 slot, maybe even a higher seed. All right. Yeah, and I think that's it. So thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks always for tuning in. Next week, we'll see what we're able to do. We may have a slight shortage of content. I'm not sure what we'll be able to record this week with Daniel being on vacation. But, guys, frankly, we've got big boy jobs. We've got lives. So sometimes we got to take a bit of a break. And I think we're both kind of at that point where we're having to take breaks in our personal lives. But we're certainly going to be recording content through the rest of the year. Always a pleasure joining in and seeing you guys and interacting with you live. You can always hit us up on Twitter at CFB Nerds. We'll hit it up with you in the comments and go back and forth. Just make sure you back up your positions and try to be civil about it. And as long as you do that, then we'll keep it engaged. All right, guys. Thanks so much. God bless.